This right here is apparently the world's highest rated bourbon. Let's see how it stacks up. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the Whiskey Nerd, and this week I'm looking at the Jim Beam Black Extra Aged Bourbon. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, why do I say this is the world's highest rated bourbon? Well, because it says it right there on the bottle. Now, that is from 2016, and for those of you keeping track, 2016 is 7 years ago. So I want to see how well this actually stands up in a modern day, because there are some fantastic bourbons out there, and I'm not sure this is going to be the world's highest rated bourbon today. This is essentially the kind of premium or higher end version of the Jim Beam White Label, which we're all very familiar with. It comes in at 43% ABV and is made up of a mash bill of 75% corn, 13% rye and 12% malted barley. So it's going to be a pretty classic bourbon profile, straight down the middle, lots of sweetness from that corn with a bit of spiciness coming through from that rye and a little bit of kind of roundness, bit caramel coming through from that malted barley. Now, it is also a non-age statement whiskey, so they do say that it's been aged for extra years. It even says it on the bottle that is an extra aged bourbon, but that doesn't really mean anything. I mean, an extra age could be 6 months, it could be 5 months, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. I do know from doing a little bit of research that the Black Label used to have an 8-year age statement. So we might imagine it's going to be around 8 years. Maybe it's a little bit younger, maybe some batches it's 7 years, some batches it's 8 years, but it's probably not going to be fully 8 years. Or it could be made up of a blend of different bourbons at different ages, some of them being maybe 8 years, maybe 9 years old, with some other whiskies coming into that blend being maybe 4 or 5 years old. It is going to be a mixed age bill. It's going to be a slightly older than the kind of classic White Label Jim Beam, which I think is 4 years old. So you can imagine the whiskey going into here is going to be between 4 and 8 years old, but it doesn't have that age statement, so the extra age bit on it is kind of a bit misleading, I think. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how they market the whiskey, how they sell the whiskey. What really matters is how the whiskey is in the glass. So it's going for the nose on the Jim Beam Black Extra Age. Okay, it's quite sweet up front, getting kind of caramel vibes, definitely some oaky spice coming through, definitely a bit of charred oak influence in there. But it's primarily, for me at least, leading in with sweetness, kind of bit of caramel, but also maybe a bit like powdered sugar, you know, where it's kind of, it's not artificial sweetness, but it's just that really kind of concentrated sugary sweetness, but it's still kind of light, if that makes sense. You like that kind of powdered sugar kind of vibe. There's definitely that kind of like, yes, powdered sugar, slightly artificial sweetness, but kind of still light, not overly sweet, just very like strong sweet flavor. There's some kind of peanut brittle, kind of peanut shell, that kind of note coming through. If you imagine, you know, peanut brittle, where you get the roasted peanuts, you get the caramel, that kind of sweetness there coming through, that kind of, yeah, there's definitely some kind of peanut note coming through here from that whiskey as well. A little bit of kind of grain sweetness too, like it is 75% corn, so you're going to get a lot of that grain sweetness, you're going to get a lot of that kind of heavy duty sweetness coming through. Bit of ethanol towards the end, the more you sit with it, but all in all, it's kind of a light nose. Now, it is coming in at 43% ABV. It's not going to be the richest of noses up front, but just kind of light, sweet, touch of oak, touch of peanut. Not really getting a huge amount of fruit. I mean, not really getting any fruit at all. Maybe a bit of like a red apple, but that's a bit of a stretch. Like we have to, yeah, I don't really think that's very fruity coming out here. It's mostly just that oak spice, that sweetness, a bit of peanuts coming through, and the kind of grain sweetness. All in all, just a very sweet, soft nose. So let's go for the palate and see how that changes. Cheers. Much of a stronger presence than on the nose. Like when it hits your mouth, you get that oak char, you get that peanuts, you get, obviously there's still a lot of sweetness coming through, but you get a lot more flavor coming through than you would originally guess from that nose. That nose was quite light. In terms of a mouthfeel, it's quite a light mouthfeel, quite like a thin mouthfeel. It's not honeyed, it's not coating my mouth or anything like that. You get a lot of flavor there, but as soon as you swallow it, it does kind of fade away a little bit. So I'm gonna go in again for a second sip, but I'm gonna kind of sit with it a little longer and see what else I can find. Cheers. Okay, After sitting with it longer, I'm not really getting a huge amount of extra notes, but I'm definitely getting a slight little bit of saltiness, like a little bit of savoriness. If you imagine like a salted caramel, that kind of flavor where you get the sweetness, but you also get a little bit of savory note coming through as well. That's kind of where it was with that. It still does feel a little, like I was saying, on the nose I was getting a little bit of ethanol. On the palate I was getting a little bit of that kind of grain alcohol, grain sweetness coming through. Maybe not the hugest amount of aging on some of it. Maybe it is a blend of some younger whiskies and some older whiskies, but definitely not getting a huge amount of like old whiskey vibes on it. Definitely a little bit of youthfulness coming through, a little bit of mouth tingly, a lot more oak spice coming through. That's probably the part that's hanging on the longest in the finish, so I'm going to talk about that in a second. But as for the rest of the palate, it was mostly just that oak spice up front, hits you down with the peanut brittle, with that caramel, and a little bit of a salty note coming through towards the tail end of the palate. So gonna go in again, but we'll talk about the finish. Cheers. Okay, on the finish, the whiskey, the sweetness does come up front and then fades off pretty quickly, leaving you with that oak spice, the bit of peanut brittle kind of note, that peanut shell, that kind of savory almost note, that's hanging on a bit with that oak spice. So it's kind of spicy on the finish, but that's not to say it's very spicy, just to say that the spicy, the oak note, that's probably a bit that hangs on the longest on the finish. Now, I'm getting a little bit almost like of a herbal note. Maybe that's from that rye kind of note, the rye character inclusion in the whiskey. Little bit of like a, kind of a, as I'm breathing, I'm getting a little bit of a herbal note, maybe like some fennel, some of those kind of dried seeds, those kind of flavors coming through. Not overly strong, but just a little bit there on the back, adding a little bit more complexity, but overall quite a short finish on the whiskey. Ultimately, this is a fine whiskey. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with this whiskey. Yeah, there's a little bit of youthfulness in here, but also it's not very expensive as whiskeys go, as bourbons go, especially today when whiskeys are getting more and more expensive. There's nothing really wrong with this whiskey. That said, there's also nothing really right with this whiskey. There's nothing mind-blowing, there's nothing different, exciting, or kind of unique about this whiskey. It's just a nice kind of middle-of-the-road, solid bourbon that is a little bit of a step up from that classic Jim Beam white label without going so far off that it probably does command a higher price tag. I am glad, I think, that I didn't buy a full-size bottle of this whiskey. So when I was in America recently, I bought a bunch of half-size bottles of bourbon so I could try out different whiskeys, so I could try a variety of different whiskeys without really having to break the bank and buy something I didn't like. Now, that said, I don't dislike this whiskey, but it's not the most exciting of whiskeys. If I was going to buy a full-size bottle of bourbon, I might go for something else, but it is, like I said, a pretty solid bourbon, and it does actually work well in a few cocktails. So I made a bourbon renewal with this whiskey and it came out really well. I'll have a video for the bourbon renewal coming out this Friday, so if you want to see that video, make sure you scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. While you're there, let me know down in the comments below what whiskey you'd like to see me review next, because I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays and I put out cocktail recipes on Fridays. So if you want to see no more, you know what you need to do. And until next time, sláinte.